Okay, we're going to be talking about multiplying and dividing integers today. And there are three multiplication rules. Positive times a positive, we're going to multiply and the answer is positive. Negative times negative, the answer is positive. And if you have a positive times negative or a negative times negative. So let's take a look at the first rule. Obviously, if you have two positive numbers, again remembering that they are marked with a positive sign, normally we drop that, and it is also customary to use parentheses to indicate multiplication. So in this case we have 2 times 3 equals 6. On a number line, remember that multiplication is repeated addition, so we're just going to take two groups of 6. They are going to the right, and so you end up with a positive 6. If we're doing this with counters, it'd just be two groups of 3, and that would give you 6. Okay, what about a positive times a negative is going to be negative. So if we have 4 times negative 3, we're going to get negative 12. And again, get used to the fact that we are dropping the dot or the x to be used for times, and we're just going to use it with parentheses. So 4 times negative 3 would be 4 times 3 in, or negative 3 in parentheses. And that's going to give you negative 12. So on a number line, again, if we have repeated addition, that would be negative 3 4 times, which is going to keep you moving to the left, and that's why you end up at a negative 12. All right, on a mat, integer mat, it would just be 4 groups of negative 3. Okay, here's the most interesting one, and this is a negative times a negative is a positive. Now there's one way we can show this using a line graph example. We'll see if it comes up. But if you notice, we have this pattern that if you have 3 times a negative 5, you get a negative 15, which is represented down here. And then let's say you take that negative 5, you multiply it by a positive 2, you get a negative 10. And the same thing with 1 times a negative 5, you get a negative 5, and 0 times negative 5 is 0. So what happens when this number, this multiplication, goes into negatives? Well, this line just can't take a different direction. It's got to continue in its same path. So that means a negative 1 times a negative 5 is going to end up being positive. And the same thing, if you keep going, negative 2 times negative 5 is a positive 10. And if we were to keep going, negative 3 times negative 5 would be positive 15. So here's one way to look at it. All right, so that's a line graph example. And the same thing, if we have negative 2 times negative 7, we're going to get a positive 14. Making sure that you put it in parentheses to show multiplication. And here's where we can show why it's going to end up being positive. So the same thing we just showed on that line graph, you can recreate just using a series of equations. And so here you have it at the end, negative 2 times negative 7 is a positive 14. All right, what about division? Well, if the definition of division is a problem that can be reworded as a multiplication problem, then the same thing's going to apply. If we have a positive divided by a positive, we're going to get positive. So again, this would be 8 divided into two groups of 4, because 4 times 2 is 8. If you have number line, or I'm sorry, integer mat, if you have 6, you can divide them into groups of 2, and that gives you 3 groups. If you have a negative divided by a positive, same thing happens on the number line. You can take 12, which is 4 groups of negative 3. on an integer mat. It is showing 12, and it is 4 groups of -3 there. All right, the same thing happens when you divide 2 negatives. Your answer ends up being a positive. So -20 divided by -2 is equal to a positive 10. And again, following that same thought that if you divide something by a negative, as you get into negatives, your quotient becomes a positive. And if you were to take any of these and say 2 times a -2, well, that's going to give you a -4. So you can turn them around and get the same multiplication problem. So here's the shortcut that I'd like to teach kids, is I say 2 sticks make a cross. Consider the negative signs the sticks, and if you take 2 of those sticks, you can make a cross. So if there's an even number of negative signs in the problem, then your answer is going to be positive. If there is an odd number of negative signs, then the answer is going to be negative. So if you have any leftover sticks, then your answer is going to be a negative answer. So count the sticks, however many negative signs are in the problem. Then go ahead and do the math, whether you're multiplying or dividing, doesn't matter which. So here's an example. If I have -2 times -20 times -1, there are 3 negative signs, which is an odd number. So that means my answer is going to be negative. Then I'm going to do the math. Well, 2 times 20 is 40, and 40 times 1 is 40. So the answer is a -40. If I'm dividing 100 divided by -4 divided by -5, there's only 2 negative signs in this problem, which means my answer is going to be positive. And then I do the math, and that's going to give me 5, so my answer is a positive 5. Okay, so what is the sign of each of these expressions? Again, for an example, if I'm looking at 8 divided by -7, I don't need you to actually solve these, just identify what the answer is going to be. In this case, there's 1 negative sign, so my answer is going to be negative. So do the rest, figure out the rest of these on your own, and again, pause the video as much as you need to. Okay, for these, go ahead and solve them. So take -5 times 2. There's 1 negative sign, so I know my answer is going to be negative. And 5 times 2 is 10, so the answer is a -10. Go ahead and do the same thing with the rest of these. Okay, your assignment is create 10 problems that show multiplication and division of integers. Again, 8 of your problems must have a negative integers in them, either in the expression or the answer. And again, for a challenge, use 2 or more digits in your problems, or answers have 2 digits. Example, 10 - 1 is a positive 1,550.